The initial frost had yet to touch the distant corners of Carbon County, but the chill was already descending slowly from the mountain peaks. By the end of October, the aspens had become faded and fragile, and the atmosphere carried that sharp stillness which caused dogs to whimper in their dreams and made windmill blades groan as if they were fading away. Jack Callan no longer paid much attention to the cold, not because he had adapted to it, but because it no longer had any way to affect him. At the age of 44, he lived alone in what had formerly served as a freight wagon, then a field hospital in times of war, followed by a border refuge for Cheyenne scouts, and now, at last, his dwelling, if a man like Jack could still call such a thing home. The wagon leaned unevenly among worn-out farming equipment and a half-ruined shed, standing amidst nothing but cracked soil, gentle hills, and crows that soared low, tracing black arcs across the sky like symbols of a lost tongue. No one traveled this far north unless they were fleeing from something or owed a debt to someone more terrifying than death itself. Jack did not run and was free of any debts. He hunted silently in the valleys, exchanged animal skins and dried meat with the Lakota widow living at the eastern side of the mountain pass, and fixed the barbed wire fences of abandoned farms nearby whenever the fierce winds ripped them apart. He spoke only when absolutely necessary. He drank only when his hands trembled from the cold or haunting dreams. Although he kept a small pistol loaded and concealed beneath his cot, he had not fired it in 5 years, not since the man in the red vest with the silver tooth came searching for a bounty but left with a broken knee and a trail of blood disappearing into the ravine. Residents of the nearby village, Hartley Ridge, with a population of barely 35 during good weather, referred to Jack as a watchman. Not because he guarded anyone, but because he observed everything. They shared tales about him. That he once cut a man's throat with a shattered spur, that he spoke Comanche fluently until part of his tongue was severed, and that he slept with one eye open and the other hidden in a box beneath the floorboards. Jack was indifferent. The greater the fear he inspired, the fewer attempted to drag him into their trivial affairs. He had been involved before. 6 years earlier, he had buried a woman on a hillside, her name eroded from the stone by poor carving and harsh weather. He had also lost a child, so tiny that she fit in the palm of his hand, wrapped in cloth, already cold. No grief remained in him, only endless days, one after another. That was the reason Jack came into town that October evening, just a usual visit. He needed tobacco, salt, flint, and grease for his wagon's axles. He always arrived near closing time when the tavern was filled with noise but the general store almost empty, when the preacher was too drunk to engage with anyone, and the blacksmith's dog had tucked itself into the ashes. Jack moved through the town almost like a shadow, seen but ignored. However, on this particular night, as he crossed the town square, something caused him to stop abruptly. There was no noise or voice, only a break in the scenery. It was a cage. Not a real one, but a makeshift enclosure made from a pig pen's frame and chicken wire, placed on top of a buckboard wagon, the muddy wheels buried nearly half a foot in the earth. Within the cage were 2 figures, a barefoot teenage girl, no older than 16, expressionless, and a baby wrapped in a ragged petticoat, softly whining like a calf dying of thirst. The woman, standing next to the wagon, had once possessed a beauty, sharp and unforgiving, like a blade meant to wound. Yet now her hair was greasy, her lips stained with saliva, and her hands clenched a bottle of cheap bourbon as if it were her only salvation. She shouted at the small crowd, mostly drifters and ranch workers seeking amusement. "They are both mine. I swear to the Lord who watches everything. I carried her in the back of a hay wagon and him in a ditch during a storm. My womb gave up more than my heart ever could. I have no use for either now. They eat, they cry, they smell. I want whiskey, not mouths. Laughter erupted. Someone threw a coin. Another called out, "Are you taking silver or bullets, Linda?" The baby's cries grew louder, not from fear but from hunger, slow and agonizing wails that made the skin crawl. The girl remained silent, sitting perfectly still, one arm wrapped around the child, the other resting limp on her knee. Her gaze was neither hopeless nor lifeless. It was calculating, as if she had already weighed every possible outcome of this moment and was simply waiting to see the final result. Jack did not move closer, at least not yet. From across the square, he observed quietly, his hand still resting on the bag of nails hidden beneath his coat. He had no familiarity with the girl or the boy standing there. Still, a restless feeling nagged at the core of his chest, either a long-buried instinct or an old scar never fully healed. Slowly, the crowd began to disperse. The woman resumed shouting, her voice losing clarity. "I'll take one jug, just one. I might even add the name of the father if that sweetens the deal." No one answered. The act had ended. People had indulged in their cruel entertainment and were now drifting away. The girl remained behind. Her eyes stayed steady, not pleading or putting on a show, simply holding her ground. When Jack started to walk away, she did something unexpected. Leaning in, she pressed a kiss on the baby's forehead and then locked eyes with him. It was not a look born of recognition, but a choice made in that moment. Amid all the suffering that had passed before her, she claimed this final conscious gesture, to make sure someone saw her, understood that she had not screamed, begged, or fallen to her knees. That gaze trailed Jack all the way back to his wagon. It stayed with him through the night as the fire snapped and he cleaned the rifle he had not touched since 1982. It lingered when the crows avoided landing near his shack the following morning, and it stayed when he opened the door to find something he could not make sense of. A baby basket wrapped in a tobacco sack resting on the frost-covered ground. Inside was the child, eyes wide open, breathing faint, arms trembling. No note, no hint of the girl, just a blood-stained handkerchief fastened to the basket's side. Right beside it lay his own knife, the one missing for months, clean, laid out with care. And somehow it felt like it was waiting. By the moment Jack carried the infant inside, frost had begun crawling up the windows like icy fingers from some strange realm. He swaddled the child in a wool shirt and set him close to the stove, where the heat slowly seeped from the iron. The baby, thin, with a red mark twisting like a question mark down his left cheek, barely moved. His breaths so shallow Jack checked twice to feel his pulse. He had seen children die quieter than rabbits, especially when they gave up hope that anyone would answer their calls. Jack had no milk, no gentle touch of a woman to calm him, no cradle, no soothing words, only boiled water, pieces of jerky moistened with spit, and silence. Yet the boy accepted it, swallowed what was offered, then slept with a stillness that reminded Jack of too many cold mornings spent on too many battlefields. The girl, however, had disappeared. For a brief moment, Jack thought she had forsaken the child, letting the basket fall like a heavy stone and fleeing into the darkness, choosing empty hunger over the burden of another stranger's mercy. But then he spotted a faint trail of blood on the porch railing, thin and intentional, as though someone had wiped a blade clean. He stepped outside. The cold air bit sharply at his lungs. The footprints were easy enough to follow, especially in snow as powdery as this. They led northward toward the old ravine where wolves had been seen 2 nights earlier. He moved swiftly, driven not by fear but by resolve, yet it was he who found her before anything else. She crouched behind a fallen cedar tree, her hands covered in dirt, eyes wide but calm. Nearby, face down and groaning, lay a man, one of the wanderers from Hartley Ridge. His shoulder was ripped open, blood soaking the ground beneath him. Jack did not ask questions. The girl offered no explanations. When she saw him, she slowly stood up, still clutching a dull, rusty hatchet in one hand. Her dress was torn at the neckline. One side of her lip was split. She looked at him as if she were already half gone from this world, as if she never expected anyone to follow, find, or care about her. Jack remained silent. He stepped past her and rolled the man onto his back. Recognition struck him quickly. The man was Maynard, known as a card cheat, occasional cattle thief, and the kind of jerk who always grinned too widely at girls who did not smile back. Jack checked for a pulse. The man was still alive. He glanced at the girl again. Now she trembled, not out of fright but from adrenaline fading. Slowly, Jack reached out and took the hatchet from her hand. She released it without protest. He never asked if Maynard had tried to harm her, because it was clear from the way she held herself and the tension in her lips. Jack dragged the man to the edge of the ravine and left him half buried in snow, still breathing. This was not an act of kindness, but a warning. Hartley Ridge would discover him, and they would understand the message. Back at the wagon, the child remained asleep, his tiny fingers curled into small fists. Jack placed a blanket over the girl and nodded towards the pot of stew. She did not eat immediately. Instead, she simply sat there, gazing at the stove as if it were a sacred place, and she waited for a sign to soothe her spirit. After some time, she picked up a spoon and began to eat. Her bites were small and deliberate. When she finished, she rose without being asked, drew water from the barrel, and cleaned the bowl on her own. Then she returned to her seat and waited again. Jack observed her carefully, wondering who had trained her to behave this way, to be seen as invisible, useful, and silent like a servant. It was not submission, but a form of protection. She had learned how to make herself appear harmless, knowing that girls who seemed harmless faced fewer consequences. Jack had encountered this behavior before. As the wind roared against the wooden frame of the wagon and the fire dwindled to glowing red coals, she took out a small piece of cloth from her coat, a square ripped from someone else's shirt, and carefully unfolded it. Inside were 2 items, a lone hair ribbon and a silver button. She handled them as if they were sacred keepsakes. Jack remained silent. Sitting opposite her, he was busy sharpening a knife. The quiet between them was neither awkward nor harsh. It just existed. After a while, she finally spoke, her tone not trembling with fear, but flat and monotone, as if reciting a list she had gone over too many times. His name's Jamie. He's 8 months old. He doesn't sleep when there is noise. He drinks goat's milk only if it's warm and settles down quicker if you hum. Jack stopped sharpening. She went on. He isn't ill, but he never cries loudly. Only soft little sounds, like he's scared to make a fuss. Her voice faltered briefly, yet she pressed on. She used to shake him when he cried. Once, she left him outside overnight. Said if he wanted to live, he had to prove it. Jack breathed out softly through his nose. Words seemed useless at this moment. Instead, he gave a single nod, set the blade down gently, and stood up. From the chest, he pulled out a saddle blanket and passed it to her. As she draped it around her shoulders, he quietly asked, "Do you have a name?" Her eyes held his for a long, intense moment, the kind that most people would shy away from. Then she softly said, "Sarah." Just that, without a surname or any further explanation. Jack did not press for more. He simply nodded back and repeated, "Sarah." It felt like they had placed the first stone in a foundation neither was ready to build. The following day, news spread through town that Maynard had been discovered alive, freezing and delirious. He recounted a strange tale about a girl, a child, and a scarred man resting a crow on his shoulder who never blinked. Most of the townspeople dismissed the story with a roll of their eyes. Others stared cautiously. The sheriff asked a few quiet questions but kept his voice low. No one wanted to stir conflict with the man traveling by wagon, especially since that kind of trouble was dangerous. Yet, despite every effort, trouble arrived anyway. 3 nights later, Jack returned from the ridge carrying rabbit meat and noticed the wagon door was open, the fire barely glowing. Inside, Linda stood holding a shotgun aimed at the ground, her hands trembling. Before her sat a man tied to the table leg with rope taken from Jack's supplies. His face showed dark bruises, and a knife rested on the floor nearby. "He came looking," she explained calmly. "Said I owed him. Claimed Jamie is not mine, and that I was only the one who survived." Her tone sank low and cold like ice melting in spring waters. Jack did not question the truth of her words because it was irrelevant. What mattered was that she hadn't fled or shouted for help. She had protected a child with nothing but rope, steel, and courage. Jack unbound the man, dragged him outside, and left him lying in the dirt with a broken nose, warning him never to return north. That was the final time anyone tried to claim Jamie. Still, it did not stop people from attempting to seize the truth itself. Later, while the boy was asleep and Linda was weaving a strip of cloth into a cord, Jack asked something he had not planned to say. "Why him?" he inquired carefully. She looked up in surprise. "Jamie. Why keep him? You could have left him behind." Her hands paused, and silence hung between them for a while. Then she whispered gently, "Because he doesn't know how to leave me, and that means I cannot leave him either." At that moment, Jack, who had once mourned a daughter he never had the chance to hold, felt a deep understanding beyond words. That evening marked the moment Jack started crafting the cradle, not using ordinary pine, not any wood bought from the store. Instead, he worked with cedar boards he had rescued from the house that was consumed by fire many years before, the one he never mentioned. Each nail hammered into that cradle was an act of reckoning. Each groove carved stood as a silent promise. When finished, he gently set Jamie inside and watched as the boy's fingers curled around the edge like roots grasping for earth. Linda smiled, and it was the first time. Not a broad grin, not radiantly joyful, but genuine. That night, they ceased to be strangers brought together by chance. They transformed into something different. Not quite a family, yet close enough to feel pain if ever torn apart. Winter had not yet fully gripped the earth, but its reach had already brushed the bare bones of the landscape. The daylight hours grew shorter, edged sharply by winds that carried the smell of stone and aged ash. and darkness fell early, sneaking in like a burglar returning to the scene. Inside the wagon, the atmosphere thickened with coal smoke mingled with the warmth of two people, still uncertain about what it meant to share close quarters. Jack moved as he always did. Slow, quiet, with the air of someone who believed walls should keep secrets and visitors should not overstay. But there was a subtle change in how he now opened the door a little more cautiously, as if listening first, or the way he always made sure to bank the fire high before fetching water from the partially frozen stream. Linda, for her part, kept her distance, yet the silence between them began to feel less empty. It carried weight and form, even a kind of cadence like wind gently brushing over a canvas that had finally been stretched tight after long sagging. She began to talk more often, not much and not frequently. But when she spoke, her words had the confidence of someone who had learned the art of survival through hard experience. She knew how to skin a rabbit, how to create remedies from moss found beneath birch trees, and how to weave a rope strong enough to restrain an adult man's wrist. Jack observed her movements. They were not those of a girl trained solely for domestic chores, but of someone who had grown up surrounded by tools, fire, and hardship. She possessed the ability to vanish within a room while still remaining aware of every subtle motion within it. She kept the child close, always secured to her body, or cradled in a sling made from an old saddle blanket. Yet there were moments when she placed him in the crib Jack had built and stared at him intently for a long time, as if committing his image to memory in case she needed to leave once more. Then the snow arrived. Not the gentle kind that whispered hope, but the heavy, relentless type that swallowed fences whole and transformed roads into treacherous white rivers. Jack had left at dawn to check the traps and stayed away longer than expected. When he finally returned, soaked up to his waist and favoring one leg after slipping on a stone, he saw Linda perched on the wagon roof, hammer in hand, repairing a leak using tar and strips of hide. The baby was inside, peacefully asleep, the fire burning steadily. She stood there alone, her hair stuck to her forehead, her face pale from the cold, but her jaw fixed firmly. He didn't question how she had climbed up or how she found the leak. Instead, he simply passed her another nail and steadied the ladder while she continued her work. That evening, something fragile shattered the quiet. Linda stood near the stove, unwrapping dried meat with hands shaking from the chill, when she said, "I once broke a man's leg. Not Maynard, someone else. He tried to claim me as his own, believed that if he paid enough, I would not resist. But I did." Jack remained silent, pouring hot water into 2 tin cups. She did not meet his eyes, but kept speaking, her voice rough like gravel dragged across wood. "They assume if you are small, you will stay small, but even rabbits will bite when their home is taken." Jack offered her a cup. Their fingers touched briefly. Neither pulled away. Then came the night that almost destroyed everything. Jack noticed that Jamie had begun coughing, a harsh, deep cough that rattled through his small ribs and turned his rest into soft whimpers. Linda barely managed to sleep. She stayed upright beside the crib, gently giving him tiny spoonfuls of water infused with pine bark and salt, boiled carefully. Jack fetched herbs from the nearby ridge, ones he recalled Linda had used years before when her own lungs failed her. Linda never asked questions. She simply crushed the herbs into pastes, massaged them into the boy's chest, and sang to him in a voice so quiet it was barely more than a whisper. On one of those bitter nights, when snow pressed heavily against the door like an unspoken judgment, she reached out and lightly touched Jack's sleeve as he handed her the kettle. It wasn't a firm hold, just the tips of her fingers resting on his forearm. like a silent thought waiting to be spoken. He glanced down at her, and for the first time, Linda met his gaze without looking away. Her eyes, rimmed with exhaustion, carried something immense and unfamiliar, a mix of gratitude tinged with caution, sorrow wrapped in quiet resolve. She softly said, "He's improving. You bought me some time." Jack did not respond. He could not. Instead, he placed the kettle down, sat beside her on the floor, and together they remained still, listening to the gentle rhythm of the baby's breath as if it were a treasure to be fiercely protected. The following morning, the wind had died down, and the snow had solidified into hard, crusty layers. Jack stepped outside to clear the pathway and inspect the shed. When he came back, he found Linda not inside the wagon, but crouched behind it in the snow, her rifle resting on her lap. As he drew nearer, she angled her head toward the trees. "Riders," she whispered. There were 2 or possibly 3 figures, too distant to be seen clearly but close enough to demand attention. Jack remained calm. He took the rifle from her, examined the chamber, and placed it aside. "Come indoors," he urged. "You and the boy." Linda paused briefly. "I can shoot," she insisted. "I know," he answered quietly, "but if things go wrong, you won't be the one they remember." The riders did not advance. They stayed at the forest's edge for about 30 minutes and then retreated along their original path. Jack watched until they vanished completely, then spent the rest of the day checking traps, his hand never far from his revolver. That evening, as Linda mended a tear in Jamie's swaddling cloth, she remarked, "They weren't merely observing. They were sizing us up, deciding if we are worth the trouble." Jack gave a small nod. "Let them wonder," he said calmly. It had become obvious that they were not as concealed as they had initially believed. This reality forced difficult decisions upon them. The wagon was too small and fragile to withstand a siege. The cabin where Jack had once lived had been destroyed by fire, yet its stone foundation remained intact in the valley. Jack suggested reconstructing it, not as a permanent dwelling, but as shelter. Linda concurred, and over the following days they transported stones and timber through the snow, shaping a structure from the wilderness that, if luck favored them, could turn into a home. The labor was grueling, bitter, harsh, and unending, but Linda never voiced complaints. She carried stones weighing twice her own body weight, chopped wood until her hands were covered in blisters, and each night she placed Jamie on a folded quilt beside the unfinished fireplace. One evening, while brushing snow from her coat and sitting by the fire, she shared, "I used to believe that survival meant staying still, remaining silent, making yourself small. Now, I think it might mean constructing something they cannot take from you." Jack looked at her then, not as a protector or a man seeking redemption, but as someone who sees a tempest approaching and chooses to face it bravely. That night, after the baby had fallen asleep and the fire had dwindled to faint embers, Jack took a piece of chalk and drew a line across the wooden beam above the door. When Linda inquired about it, he answered, "That marks day one of something that belongs to us, not merely what was left behind." In that instant, she rose and did something neither expected. Her hand reached up and drew a second mark beside his. "Then we count together," she said. It was not a vow of trust nor a statement of love. However, it was the first action they shared that was unrelated to running. For people like them, this carried a weight greater than either would openly admit. Winter grew deeper, with a silence that felt more like judgment than calm. pressing heavily over the land until even the wind faltered between breaths. The half-built cabin stood as a dark blemish against the snowdrifts, its stone walls only reaching waist height, the roof merely a skeleton of pine logs and frozen resolve. Still, every day, Jack and Sarah came back to it, carrying what they could, bracing against cold that bit through boots and chilled bones. Jamie had mostly stopped coughing. His sleep remained restless, but he ate better, his cheeks now showing faint hints of color, and he had started reaching for things, small hands curling with intent toward the firelight, the folds of Sarah's coat, the edge of Jack's sleeve. He made no sound while doing so, no cries or coos, only breath and movement, like a spirit cautiously claiming its place within a body. Jack found himself watching him more frequently these days, not with anxiety, but with an unfamiliar, unwanted tenderness concealed behind rough hands and quiet justifications. The boy was not his by blood and bore no right to his heritage. Yet sometimes when Jamie nestled his face against Jack's chest, the man lingered just a moment longer than usual, as if frozen by a fear that the child might disappear like smoke if he moved. Then, one evening, the sky changed in that eerie manner that always preceded the fiercest storms, its color becoming dull, the air unnervingly still, and the silence so absolute it seemed as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Jack was the first to notice this. He stopped mid-swing, axe poised above a block of wood hardened by ice, and gazed intently towards the horizon. No signs of life, no birds flying, no breeze rustling the leaves, only a strange pressure pressing against his ears, like a heavy presence settling in. He let the axe fall without finishing the chop. Inside the wagon, Linda was boiling cloth and slicing dried roots into thin pieces to brew tea. Jack entered silently and started fastening the shutters, stuffing old rags into the gaps around the doorframe. Linda did not question him. She simply lowered the fire, tightened Jamie securely into his sling, and pulled on her boots. That was what defined them now. No spoken warnings were needed because they understood perfectly well. Yet they were not prepared for how quickly it would arrive. Within 60 minutes, snow began falling. Not soft flakes, but sharp, hard particles that stung on contact and hissed as they hit surfaces. The temperature plunged rapidly. Trees creaked beneath ice they hadn't supported in many decades. Then, just as darkness enveloped the ridges, the wind appeared. Not a distant howl, but a sudden, piercing scream that tore across the land as if dragging something unseen behind it. The fire in the stove flickered weakly. The wagon groaned under the force. Jamie whimpered quietly, clutching tightly to Sarah's chest. Jack muttered curses softly, slipped on his coat and headed outside, a lantern swinging at his side. The shed's roof rattled loudly. He managed to reach halfway before powerful gusts snatched the lantern from his hand and smashed it against the icy wall. In total darkness, he reached the shed and began securing anything he could: ropes, pelts, and the drying rack. Then came a deep crack. Not thunder, not a fallen branch, but something more primal. The ground itself shook. Jack turned just in time to see the stovepipe torn loose by the wind crashing into the wagon, sparks flying everywhere. Flames erupted instantly as dry wood and pitch caught fire. He sprinted forward. Sarah was already outside, holding Jamie, who clung to her tightly, her hair wild around her face and her eyes reflecting the blaze. Jack grabbed her arm and pulled her back just as the heat surged outward. The wagon groaned louder, then collapsed. It did not explode. It simply fell apart like a fading memory unable to bear the weight. Everything inside, bedding, food, tools, and the crib was lost. They remained silent. There was simply nothing left to say. In the scorching light, with snow turning into a fierce blizzard and the wind howling like a curse, Jack pointed toward the cabin. It had no roof, but stone walls stood firm. It offered protection from the wind, though not from the cold. They hurried forward, Jamie wrapped snugly between them, his small frame silent yet warm. They arrived just as the wind sent the last plank of the wagon's frame crashing to the ground. Inside the cabin shell, Jack sparked a small fire with dry kindling he had stashed beneath the stones on the floor. The smoke lingered low, but the fire burned steadily. Linda crouched in the corner. Jamie pressed close to her chest, and for the first time since Jack had met her, she seemed frightened. Not angry, not defensive, simply human. Jack sat next to her, removed his coat, and draped it over them both. They remained quiet for a time as the wind fought to creep through the stone walls and the snow hissed against the broken frame overhead. Then she whispered, her voice faint. "I always thought when it burned, I would feel free." He turned to look at her. The wagon. She shook her head. The past. Jack closed his eyes. His hands still carried the scent of smoke. His bones ached in that familiar way they had since the war. A pain that meant survival came at a cost, leaving fragments behind in the snow. He reached out, paused, then rested his palm gently on Jamie's back. The child stirred but did not wake. Linda did not pull away. She said softly, "I named him after a ghost." Jack did not ask which one. She never said. Outside, the wind quieted just before dawn. Inside, the fire endured, barely flickering. In that moment, caught between ruin and dawn, a subtle change occurred once more. It was not loud, nor announced boldly. Instead, it came softly, like roots shifting beneath frozen ground, patient, unwavering, and unavoidable. They had lost all their belongings. Yet, they had not lost each other. Not yet. The days that followed the blaze merged into a pattern that felt less like recovery and more like adapting to harsh new realities. The cabin, only half finished, was all they had for shelter. Though lacking a roof, it stood firm against the wind, with animal pelts hanging from the rafters and tarps stretched over beams to block the snow. Jack strengthened the walls, hammering nails into icy timber with hands numbed and raw from the cold. Linda melted snow for drinking water and showed Jamie how to sip from a tin cup she had fashioned a handle for. Their food stores were gone. No flour, no salt, only what Jack could catch and what Linda could prepare from bark and roots. Hunger was not unfamiliar to them, but now it felt crueler, more urgent. Hunger that disturbed sleep and sharpened tempers. Yet there were moments filled with gentle calm. Jamie started to crawl, slow and awkward over the furs, his small hands stretching out toward the heat of the fire or the rim of Jack's boot. One time, Jack found him gnawing on an empty bullet casing and did not reprimand him, simply swapping it for a strip of jerky and murmuring, "Better to learn early what danger tastes like." Linda chuckled at that. Soft, unexpected, a sound rusty from long silence. At that instant, Jack understood he had not heard true laughter in more than a year. Not since the night the river froze solid and claimed the last of his mules beneath the ice. Outside their delicate refuge, the world had not forgotten them. Instead, it had grown uneasy and restless. It started with murmurs in Hartley Ridge, initially faint, the kind that lingered in tavern corners and traveled on the backs of supply wagons. Maynard, only partly healed and filled with even more anger, was spreading tales once again. Stories about the girl with the blade and the infant she insisted was not hers. About the man with empty eyes and silence as dark as crows who abandoned him to bleed in the snow. People heard these tales, then dismissed them, only to hear again. Because when stories are repeated, doubt grows, and doubt always demands someone to blame. By the time spring's initial thaw transformed the paths into streams of mud, the gossip had become serious. A preacher's wife insisted she had spotted Sarah in town some years ago, already noticeably pregnant, though not a single man had come forward as the father. The general store vendor murmured that he once saw Jack hold a baby as if he were weighing a rock, not like a man should handle an infant. Elderly women near the boarding house remembered how Sarah had been cast out from her mother's household, her name erased from the family Bible. No one inquired why. No one considered the price a girl paid to be wiped away like that. They only recalled the empty spaces and filled them with dread. Then the preacher arrived himself, with one eye, a white beard, and a voice heavy with scripture and bitterness. He rode up the mountain path on a loaned mule, clutching a Bible in one hand and a petition in the other. He found Jack splitting wood and wasted no time on pleasantries. "You've taken in an unclean woman and an illegitimate child, Mr. Callan," he stated bluntly, "and that's a blot this county cannot tolerate." Jack kept chopping without pause, never glancing at him. The preacher continued. "People are anxious. They whisper the boy is cursed, that he never cries, that she cannot sleep, that wolves gather around your cabin as night falls." He stopped briefly to adjust the reins. "They want them gone. Sent to the mission, perhaps, or returned to wherever she came from. You can remain, naturally. No one desires conflict, only calm." Jack swung the axe, splitting a log cleanly, then remarked, "Have you ever read the part where Christ said, 'Let the little children come to me'?" The preacher sneered in response, "Not when they are born in sin." Jack looked up slowly and sharply. "Then you should read it again. The entire passage, not just the sections that justify your cowardice." The preacher left, but he did so without any silence. By the end of the week, a small group appeared, 3 men and 2 women, all dressed in their Sunday best with stern faces that camouflaged their self-righteous fear. Linda was the first to notice them. She was bathing Jamie in a wooden basin outside, softly humming to herself when she caught a glimpse of movement through the trees. She did not scream or run away. Instead, she wrapped the baby, handed him to Jack, and picked up the rifle resting against the stump. At first, they did not brandish any weapons. They attempted politeness instead. They spoke about the welfare of the community, disturbance among the respectable families, and concerns regarding unnatural conduct. They politely asked just once if Linda would consider leaving. They claimed she frightened the farm animals, that the dogs would not cease barking whenever she passed by, and that the air around her felt unnatural. Linda remained silent, standing still with the rifle aimed at the ground. Jack waited for them to finish and then posed a single question. "Which one of you intends to take the child from her arms?" No one answered. He moved forward, holding Jamie in one arm, while his other hand rested on the knife attached to his belt. She carried him through the harsh winter, nourished him even when her own body had nothing left to give, stood guard over him when the fire destroyed everything. Do you think some lawless decree grants you the right to take that away from her? His voice was quiet but hit like a powerful storm. If you want him, then come and get him. But I assure you, there will be no mercy, only tombs." They left, not all of them without resistance. For a while, the mountain fell silent once more. But silence never means peace. It is merely the calm before the outcry. One evening, as distant thunder rumbled and the wind carried the smell of damp ash, Jamie suddenly started to cry. Not a soft whimper or a hunger cry, but a loud, fierce scream that shook his tiny frame and flushed his face bright red. He did not stop. Linda rocked him back and forth, sang softly to soothe him, tried warm milk and cool cloths, whispered prayers she had not uttered since her childhood. Nothing helped. Jack built the fire higher, checked for fever, wounds, or broken bones. Jamie wept endlessly until abruptly he ceased, too suddenly. His body relaxed completely, not lifeless but detached, as if something inside had switched off. Jack held him tightly, heart racing, uncertain what he was witnessing. Linda took him back, laid him down, placed her ear against his chest, then quietly said, "He is in shock." Then, as if moved by an unseen force, she stood up, walked to the rear of the cabin and began pulling stones from the floor. Jack did not grasp the truth until Linda revealed the package. Worn cloth, wrapped in waxed paper and secured with twine. Inside, there was a photograph. A man with a defined jawline, dressed in a uniform, his eyes strikingly similar to Jamie's. A name was hastily written on the back in trembling ink. Ben Tillman, July 5th, 1885. Linda passed it to Jack and explained, "That was his father. He perished in a mining accident in Missouri. They erased his existence, claimed he was unworthy. My family insisted I was fabricating it, said I had conjured a ghost." She knelt next to Jamie. "He is not cursed. He is mourning someone he never knew, just like me." Jack stayed silent. He simply sat beside her and silently placed his hand over Jamie's chest. And he waited. That evening, the boy shifted. His hand wrapped around Jack's thumb. Linda, her eyes dry but rimmed with red, murmured, "You cannot mend what people fear, but you can survive beyond it." And finally, Jack believed she was right. Spring arrived with its typical intensity, overflowing river banks, cracking rocks under melting strain, snapping branches like fragile bones. The valley thrummed with signs of new life, yet on the hillsides the earth stayed firm, and the frost lingered like a stubborn shadow. Jack had finally finished a sturdy roof for the cabin, sloped and sealed with tar, supported by beams rescued from the old mill. Linda had sown a row of early potatoes in a furrow behind the barn. Jamie, now steady on his feet like a young foal, wandered in endless circles near the fire pit, sometimes dragging a stick or clutching a tin cup as if it were a precious find. They were piecing together what resembled a life, even though the air still carried traces of smoke and ash. Yet both understood that this calm was only temporary. It arrived suddenly one morning with the sound of hooves striking damp stone. Too many for simple travelers and too calculated for merchants. Jack stood on the porch, his rifle slung across his chest. Linda moved Jamie indoors silently. 4 men rode into the clearing, clad in tan coats, their spurs jingling and guns hanging loosely at their sides. Although lacking badges, they carried the burden of authority, perhaps self-imposed but undeniably heavy. The leader, a stocky man bearing a scar over his temple and a star pinned to his vest, dismounted slowly and came forward. "Are you Jack Callan?" the man asked, his voice rough and soaked with a whiskey-like grit. Jack gave a single nod. The man motioned to the group behind him. These men come under orders from territorial law. That young woman in your cabin, she faces serious charges, theft, rebellion, desertion, helping fugitives. There are even rumors of sorcery. He grinned without any warmth. Quite the list for such a small person. Jack remained silent. The man tilted his head slightly. We are taking her. You can either cooperate easily, or make this a lesson. Sarah then stepped outside, holding Jamie at her hip. Her gaze was steady. No hesitation, no begging. She stood beside Jack and simply said, "No." Just a clear refusal. No screams, no tears. A firm declaration. The tension hung heavy. Suddenly, the man moved forward, but Jack was quicker. The rifle's butt connected sharply with the man's jaw, sounding like a breaking branch, and pandemonium broke free. The other riders drew their guns. Jack fired once, hitting a man in the leg, then dove behind a pile of barrels. Sarah placed Jamie on the ground carefully, pushed him behind the well, and snatched the rifle she had kept hidden beneath the porch. Smoke and yelling filled the air. Jamie let out a small cry, his voice bright and urgent. One attacker tried to circle the cabin, but Sarah hit his shoulder hard, sending him tumbling. A bullet grazed Jack's side. He stumbled but kept shooting. Then the flames began to spread. A lantern, knocked over in the chaos, caught the side of the barn. Flames surged upward as if they had been waiting for this moment. The horses screamed desperately, and the clearing quickly filled with thick smoke. Linda ran toward the well, grabbed Jamie, turned around, and saw Jack kneeling, blood gushing from his thigh, the main rider standing over him with a revolver pointed straight at his forehead. She did not think at all. She did not take careful aim. She simply screamed and pulled the trigger. The bullet struck the man's neck. He fell silently, blood splattering the stones beneath him. Jack crumpled backward, struggling to breathe. The other men fled, carrying their injured comrades, abandoning the fire and the fallen. Linda dropped the gun and rushed to Jack. He was barely conscious, teeth clenched tightly. One hand pressed firmly to his thigh where blood flowed rapidly and hot. She ripped off his belt, tied it tightly above the wound, and pressed a cloth into the hole. He said nothing, only stared at her with the same calm resolve he had when teaching her how to read the wind. She whispered softly, "Stay with me." He blinked once. She said it again, "Do not leave." Jamie then crawled into Jack's lap, wrapping his small arms awkwardly around his ribs. Jack made a sound, whether a groan, a laugh, or something in between. Linda looked down at them both and realized that no one else was coming. No doctor, no authority, no rescuer, only they were left. So she carried him inside, lit a fire, boiled water, and did whatever needed to be done. She stitched the injury using a strand of her own hair carefully pulled from a comb and held Jack's hand whenever his trembling became too intense. Jack remained silent. He never uttered a cry, yet once, as his temperature soared, he murmured a single word. Just one. "Stay." And she remained. For 3 long days, she did not close her eyes to sleep. With one hand, she nourished Jamie, and with the other, she gently lowered Jack's fever. On the 4th day, the high temperature finally subsided. When Jack opened his eyes and noticed her curled up beside him, clutching Jamie like a protective shield, he reached out, weak and shaking, placing his hand on the boy's back. There were no promises made, no solemn oaths exchanged, only the simple touch, only the quiet presence. And for them, that was everything that mattered. When the snow returned once more, gentler this time and without harshness, the cabin remained intact. The barn had vanished. Its charred frame lay buried beneath fresh ash, but the house endured. Walls patched up, roof covered with rugged wooden shingles, windows fitted with glass salvaged from an abandoned church that Jack had helped repair years ago, back when he believed hard work could atone for mistakes. Now it served a different purpose altogether. It was not a fortress, it was not a sanctuary. Simply a place that offered warmth throughout the night and silence that did not judge. Jack moved more slowly now, his injured leg a constant reminder, growing stiffer whenever the wind turned cold, but he still kept moving. He tended the fire with a tenderness previously reserved only for weapons. He carved a new cradle out of pine he dried himself, making it smoother than the first, shaped with calm patience rather than urgency. Jamie had started to speak in small fragments, odd mixes of sounds and meaning, some mirroring Linda's gentle tone, others clipped like the orders Jack used to give to a stove or a mule. The boy ran in uneven circles, often stumbled, yet always laughed as he got back up, his determination a quiet form of rebellion. Sarah had transformed as well. She no longer glanced nervously behind her while chopping wood. Once a month, she strolled into town with her head held high, jaw firm, Jamie resting on her hip, daring anyone to speak against her. Nobody did. Not anymore. The preacher had disappeared. Some claimed he had fled the county altogether. The others had grown silent. There had been no arrests and no trial. Too much blood had soaked into that mountain for justice to take hold. Instead, the rumors faded away. Fear shifted elsewhere. What lingered, like smoke after a fire, was an unusual kind of respect. Not fondness, not faith, but something heavier. The burden a community places on things it cannot understand yet knows better than to confront. That winter, Jack started teaching Sarah how to read properly. Not just names and signs, but entire sentences, thick paragraphs, old ledger entries, and worn storybooks that had somehow endured both harsh weather and war. At first, she read slowly, lips barely moving, finger following each word like navigating unknown terrain. But she was quick to learn, and soon she no longer needed assistance. Instead, she read aloud to Jamie in the evenings, her voice soft yet steady, shaping tales from pages written for lives very different from their own, and yet somehow still resonating with truth. One evening, as snow quietly settled against the windows and the fire flickered softly in the fireplace, Sarah was reading from a children's primer about a boat crossing a river and a man who gave his coat to a child. When she finished, she glanced over and saw Jack asleep. Not slumped or collapsed, but resting with his arms folded and one boot still half tied, as if he had intended to get up soon, but then forgot. Jamie lay curled up at his feet. She did not rouse either of them, simply set the book aside and observed their steady breathing. Their life was not filled with happiness, yet it was a life of choice, and for them that mattered more than anything. In the early spring, Jack placed a stone at the boundary of the field. It bore no name or date, only a carving of a crow in flight with outstretched wings, deeply etched into the granite. When Sarah inquired about it, he replied, because not everything must be spoken aloud to be remembered. She understood perfectly. Many years passed, but the mountain never forgot them. Travelers would tell stories of a man with a limp and a girl who could shoot better than most men, about a boy who once never cried but later sang to goats and named the wind. Some claimed the cabin had been a fortress, while others insisted it was a prison. However, those who stayed long enough and saw the garden Sarah had planted and the porch Jack repaired each spring told a different tale. They said it was a new beginning, and that was enough.